The fences are gone, curled into black ribs, and she's still standing where the house used to breathe, ears flicking for walls that are no longer there. He holds out sugar water like a prayer, smoke lifting from the earth in thin blue threads. And somewhere under ash, a hive remembers its own name. If he signs the papers, the ground will be paved quiet. If he stays, the wind may take them again. Listen. Do you hear it? That small, stubborn hum beneath the ruin? The sound of sweetness refusing to die. Tonight, he will lead her back through the fireline to the old oak, to ask what the land keeps when it loses everything. And if the queens are still singing, they won't leave. Smoke lay low over the valley, like water that had forgotten how to move, and the mare stood where a doorway used to hold the house together, ears flicking for walls that were no longer there. The fences had curled into black ribs along the slope, each post the finger pointing nowhere. He came up the path without a path to follow, boots sinking in ash that sighed under his weight, a metal pail knocking against his knee with a soft, hollow bell. He stopped when she turned her head. Soot had silvered her lashes. Her breath showed itself in the cold, a pale cloud rising and folding back into the ruins. He lifted a hand slowly, palm open, the way he always had, as if the air between them still knew its work. The world had gone quiet except for a far siren, thin as thread, and something else that didn't belong to sirens or wind. He set the pail on a scorched sill, took out a glass jar warm from his coat, and mixed sugar with the creek water he'd carried up, stirring until it went clear like a small, hard-won truth. He cupped the sweetness and brought it to her mouth. Her muzzle was warm and trembled against his skin. She took the water as if remembering the verb for trust. The hum reached him then, not loud, not sure of itself, but steady, a tremor under the ruin like a heartbeat in a dream. He waited. It came again, a thread weaving through cinders, pulling him toward the far corner where the kitchen once jarred summer into amber rose. He moved carefully, the mare stepping after him, hooves tapping glass to powder. A frame lay half buried, scorched to bone. Beneath it, a charred log had cracked open along a seam. He bent and pressed 2 fingers to the fissure, feeling a warmth that wasn't from the day. He brushed away ash with the edge of his sleeve. In the seam, the faint congregation of wings. A small cluster, soot-dusted and stubborn, circling a center he could not yet see. He did not speak. Words would be too heavy. He only breathed, letting breath be a signal, the way smoke signals bees that disruption means gentleness, not fear. The mare lowered her head until her whiskers tickled his knuckles. Together they listened. The hum deepened, not louder, but nearer, like a hand placed over a chest finding a pulse. He slid his shoulders under the frame and lifted, inch by inch, until the crack widened enough for light to enter. There, in the guttering glow of late day, the queen moved like a slow spark, surrounded by attendants who believed in her with their bodies. He closed his eyes. The valley smelled of wet ash and pine resin. A sweetness burned thin, but not gone. When he opened them, he looked past the ruin to the old oak at the fence line, bark blackened but crown still faint and stubborn against the dimming sky. He had always walked there at dusk, the mare at his shoulder, a ritual so small that it had never needed a name. He stood, and the mare stood with him. He poured the last of the sugar water into a shallow tin and set it near the crack, a blessing spread as thin as it needed to be. Then he took the halter from his belt, blue once, now gray, and lifted it toward her cheek. She did not flinch. Leather met buckle with a sound like a promise remembered. They went together through the burned rooms without roofs, stepping over the clean edges where walls had been. The cold pressed in as if to test their shape. At the threshold of nothing, he paused, hand in vermain, and turned toward the oak. The hum, faint but insisting, followed them, through ash that took their prints, down the slope that used to be a yard, past the line where flame had stopped as if out of breath. Under the oak, he set his palm to the trunk and felt the living within the char, slow and old. The mare breathed against his shoulder. Somewhere behind them, the small life in the crack kept singing. He understood nothing, and enough.
Morning used to enter the valley like honey poured thin, catching on leaves and fence wire, turning breath to gold. Before fire taught the land a harsher alphabet, the house wore its timbers easy, each board seasoned by winters and jokes traded across the porch. He rose when the eastern ridge blued, slid boots onto cold floors, and stepped into air salted with dew and apple skin. The mare watched him from the orchard's edge, ears forward, the same quiet question she asked every dawn. Are we moving as one? He answered with ritual. Veil hung loose at his neck. Smoker lit with dry pine needles and a curl of burlap. Coaxed rather than forced, the way a good word warms a room. He lifted frames that sweated nectar, weight settling into wrists and back in a language he trusted. Steady, unhurried, useful. Bees stitched the morning with a low thread that pulled loose thoughts into pattern. He listened with his hands. A hive could be read by touch. The hum's pitch, the fanning at the entrance, the small storm when sunlight sliced the dark. He learned to enter like weather learns a field, without startling it. The mare kept pace between rows, hooves whispering over fallen fruit. She had come to him as a rumor of trouble, head-shy, rain-scared, a skidder at plastic bags no wind could reason with. He did not correct her with volume. He offered presence, ropes loosened before obedience was asked, circles drawn smaller, then wider, breath timed to hers until both their rib cages remembered a shared rhythm. He walked her through shade and sun, letting light flicker across her eyes until blink became ease. In those early months, he taught her the orchard's map, where the creek made the bank soft, where the fence sagged in winter, where the oak's shadow moved like a sundial over grass. She taught him to check the ground before the sky. On the porch, steam rose in the shape of mornings. A second mug waited, sometimes filled by hands that matched his in patience and found his missing words before he noticed their absence. Laughter made the bees fly a little wilder, then settle calmer. A radio murmured news in the kitchen. A dog, a namesake no one remembered choosing, slept, occasionally dreaming of running. He traded jars of last summer for work he couldn't do alone. A neighbor mended the gate, another fixed the well pump. He mended a saddle strap, cut a sugar maple branch clean where rot had whispered. The valley was small enough that kindness circulated like pollen, unseen and necessary. He moved through months by bloom, willow first, then dandelion, the orchard's white storm, blackberry thickets humming as if electricity had learned a softer use. June's frames came heavy. He worked them slow, knife sliding through capped comb with a hush that felt like prayer. The mare stood close enough for honey scent to lace her breath. Sometimes he dipped a finger and held it toward her. Sometimes he kept sweetness to himself, a private bargain with the day. In heat, he opened the barn doors and let shade fold around the aisle. Bees gathered at the water trough's rim, little rafts of amber, living, and he flicked a wet palm to give them safer footholds. The mare lowered her muzzle to drink, bees parted and closed like thoughts. Storms rehearsed themselves over the ridge each afternoon. He watched cloud shoulders muscle up, read wind in the orchard's changing whisper, and checked fences twice. He had learned the valley's moods the way a partner learns the grammar of another face. The crease that means worry, the stillness that means joy. There were years he could predict rain from the bees' heaviness. Years the mare's unrest carried a warning long before the weather radio gave it a name. He layered tarps where needed, weighted them with stones, and tied the smoker where it would not fall. He cleared dry brush from under the lowest limbs. He did not think of disaster as a story. He thought in actions that reduced its appetite. On Sundays, he let the day spool out slower. He checked the queen by sight, not just by pattern, and spoke her name softly, not because she understood it, but because saying it reminded him that even small rulers carry a country in their bodies. He brushed the mare until her coat took the light, mane detangled to clean lines, and then walked her down to the creek to watch minnows stitch silver across shade. The world felt complete by its own rules: bees, horse, water, man, each keeping faith with the other's needs. In late evening, he tracked the sun to the oak and stood with his shoulder against bark that took his weight without judgment. He counted the things that did not need counting. When lightning finally tore open a summer night, it arrived like someone else's argument thrown across his table. The ridge burned for a heartbeat and went dark. He stood barefoot on the porch boards, rain not arriving, air holding its breath. He listened for the mare's hooves, the bee's pitch, the first pop of resin in the hills. The radio spoke alert tones in a measured voice. He stepped off the porch and the grass broke underfoot like paper. Ritual became readiness without drama. He loosened gates. He filled a trough to the brim. He lined the smoker with wet burlap and prayed not to need it. In his mind, he walked the orchard's map again. Every path, every hazard, every mercy. Because this was how you loved the place. You learned it by heart until the heart could guide your hands in the dark. The first morning after the ash settled, a white truck rolled up the dirt road like a clean shirt to a funeral. 2 men and a woman stepped out, their boots unscuffed, their clipboards bright. The mare lifted her head, blew softly, and watched from the skeletal shade of the barn's ribs. He wiped his hands on his jeans and met them at the line where the mailbox used to stand. They spoke in the measured tone of people trained to move bad news along. Disaster relief options, expedited permits, fast-tracked development meant to protect against future fires. Maps unfolded across the tailgate in cheerful colors, greens and blues and soft oranges, blocking the valley's black and gray beneath a quilt of proposals. She pointed to a broad ribbon where a new access road would run. Safer egress, she said, a protection for all. The ribbon bisected his orchard and the old oak without apology. A rectangular parcel shaded in mint covered his house, his kitchen's ghost, his jars of summer turned to gravel and assurances. The sum, they explained, reflected market conditions and risk. The number had edges that would close around him if he let them. He traced the paper smoothness with a soot-stained finger, then looked up at the slope. The char emphasized things he had always known by feel. The way the hillside cupped rain when it came, the way wind tunneled and broke along the oak's shoulders, the way bees preferred the south-facing rise at 10 in the morning when light skimmed the grass like a hand. He asked for time. They nodded as if time were theirs to grant, left behind a folder that smelled faintly of new ink, and promised to return next week when the signatures would be easier. At the creek, the mare drank and watched him count stones. He filled buckets, the handles cutting lines into his palms, and watered the single green things he had found. A stubborn fern under the porch steps, a cluster of grass near the well casing, a weed he could not name shouldering up through gravel as if stubbornness were botany. He set a feeder near the crack where the small cluster hummed and told himself it was triage, not hope. The insurance adjuster came with a camera and practiced sympathy. He photographed absence, the stove's outline on the floor, the place where a table's legs had kept a square of wood from burning, the palm-sized mark on a wall where a child once leaned, hair damp from creek water. He wrote down numbers that wanted to be math and left him with a different folder, this one thicker, heavier with conditions. Payments would come, but not now, and not all, and not for trees that did not count as inventory. The oak, he was told, was an act of God. The bees, uninsurable loss. The mare, a personal asset with no calculable depreciation for love.
The well pump coughed and hesitated. He bent and listened, laid a hand on the casing. The water ran thin as a promise spread too far. When the pump failed, it did so without drama, the silence afterward a clean cut. He leaned his forehead to metal cooled by shade and let himself stand still long enough to feel how tired bones can be. From down valley, a chainsaw started up, then another. The mare snorted, skittered a half step, then came back to touch his shoulder with her mouth, feeling for anchor. He drove into town in a borrowed truck, traded a jar of last year's blackberry for a coil of pipe and a handful of rusted fittings, and learned that what he needed, new pump, new wiring, new patience, cost more than any jar could buy. On the feed store bulletin board, a paper advertised, "Cash offers, we buy burned parcels, quick close." He stood in front of the board longer than he meant to, reading the same words until they lost their letters' shapes. On his way out, he saw his neighbor Ruth in the parking lot, eyes swollen, a box of kitchen things on the hood of her car, a paper with a signature clipped to the corner. "They said the road will save us next time," she said, voice flat from too much explaining. "They said I could move closer to my daughter, get a new start." He hugged her. She did not cry then. She had done that already, somewhere else. He watched her drive away with a plant that used to live on a sunny windowsill, leaves trembling in the truck cab's broken air. He carried the folder back up the valley, the paper heavier now that he had seen it with someone else's ink. In the late afternoon heat, he set it on the kitchen's ghost and flipped through pages that assumed a future without asking if the past had anything to say. The mare dozed in a rectangle of light, lower lip slack, the kind of sleep horses reserve for places they consider church. He could sign, move, cut grief into pieces that fit into boxes and storage units, learn new weather without this valley's stubborn wind. He could sell the mare to someone with a green pasture that hadn't learned the word cinder. He could become a man who once kept bees. A distant crack broke the quiet, not thunder, not a branch. Chainsaws on the far slope where the line of the proposed road met the creek. He slid the papers back into their folder, closed the folder, and balanced a stone on top without noticing the impulse to weigh choice with matter. He walked to the fireline at the property's edge where flames had lost their appetite weeks ago and stopped as if embarrassed by their own hunger. The ground there told another story. Ash-etched paw prints, thin deer tracks, a fox's neat stitch, the small comma of a quail foot. He stepped carefully, reading. A darker seam in the charred caught his eye. A log split lengthwise along a fault baked into its grain. He knelt, brushed with 2 fingers as if cleaning a wound. Heat rose from the seam, not the days, but the bodies. He laid his palm flat, felt the thrum before he heard it, the way a chest announces it's living before breath becomes visible. He leaned closer until his ear nearly touched blackened wood. The hum resolved itself, timid and tenacious, the song of a handful remnant still keeping order around the center. Attendants passing, fanning, a queen moving like a thought too delicate to hold and too strong to ignore. He wanted to laugh and to pray, and neither fit the width of his throat. He turned his head, found the mare's eye at his shoulder, dark and calm, a circle that had held his reflection before and held it now without judgment. He slid his fingers along the seam and widened it a finger's width, then another, until a sliver of light could find the bees. He set a shallow dish of sugar water and a peel of apple he had saved without knowing why. He whispered because the day seemed to require it. "I see you."
A pickup down the slope revved and paused. Men's voices threaded the trees, evaluating grades, marking trees with paint that would not wash off in a single rain. He stood and felt the pull of two hungers, the need to stay where his hands knew the work, and the need to protect his body and the mares from the kind of future that arrives with reflective vests and pre-approved phrases. In his pocket, the pen, heavy enough to bruise; at his feet, the hum light enough to heal. The next day stacked themselves like uneven boards. He hauled water from the creek, cut and bent metal into temporary shapes that suggested a well's future, rigged a shade cloth over the cracked log to keep the remnant from cooking under noon's blunt eye. He moved hives closer to the ground that still remembered cool. He had no frames to spare, but he had hands, and hands could carry until frames could be made. Nights he lay on a cot under the barn skeleton and listened to wind teach the new openings how to sing. Sometimes he woke to the mare's breath on his cheek, measuring his sleep for harm. Sometimes sirens stitched the dark and passed on. The radio said the ridge was contained. The radio had been wrong before. The developers returned with a man whose handshake tried to be firm and warm at once. He used his first name as a tool, slid it between sentences like a wedge, and spoke of resilience as a brand that could be monetized if approached properly. He pointed to a section on the map shaded pale where a community center could anchor the rebuilt valley. He pointed to a rectangle where honey-themed shops might bring tourism. A sweet comeback story, he said without irony. He promised to honor heritage with a plaque by the road. The plaque's font, he said, would be tasteful. He looked at the pale shading where the oak should be and asked what shade the map would use for a living memory. The man's smile did not move. He talked about wildfire corridors, defensible space, and economies of scale. He did not talk about bees as archivists or horses as witnesses. He did not talk about a hum that made a man's knees shake because it proved that life can be as small as a finger and still have the weight of a vow. The hearing was set for 2 weeks. Bulldozers would begin preliminary grading after, contingent on approvals he had not granted, but that would happen to him regardless if he did nothing. He walked with the mare at dusk to the line where heat had stopped and night resumed. He held the halter loose. She chose pace and path. At the crack, the remnant had thickened, workers heavier with purpose. The queen circled tighter and more assured. He lifted the dish, refilled it, and watched tongues unroll like tiny scrolls memorized long before he was born. He took the folder from his pocket and opened it on the log, paper white against carbon black. He read the paragraph that described his land as an asset class, the clause that allowed amendments without further consent. He imagined his signature laying down like a bridge across his own heart and felt the weight of the first step he would not be able to take back. The mare shifted, pressed her shoulder lightly into his arm, the way she did when asking him to move forward. He did not. He traced the split in the wood and thought of the oak's core under char, the water waiting beneath the well's silence, the way a hive will swarm rather than smother when the old home can no longer hold what's alive inside it. He closed the folder and set it aside. He did not throw it away. He did not sign. He cut a strip of old veil into a narrow ribbon and tied it around the branch above the crack, a small flag for a country that would not appear on anyone's map. He turned to the mare and lifted the lead. Together, they walked the perimeter of a future yet unmade. The days after the choice did not announce themselves. They simply arrived thinner, as if light had to pass through gauze to reach the ground. He woke before the ridge blued and lay listening for a hum that was not yet sure it wanted to be heard. Wind moved through the barn's bare rafters, teaching absences a tune. The mare stood where dawn found her, head angled to catch whatever news the air might carry. He rose into a cold that had lost a house's habit of warming him as he dressed. He marked time with small salvations. A tarp stretched tight over the hive's cracked shelter. A line of stones to keep runoff from scouring the seam. A feeder refreshed with sugar water, steady as breath. The remnant thickened by degrees, and his hands learned new patience, the kind that accepts the slowness of life as a discipline rather than a punishment. He replaced the well's dead silence with a temporary system. Buckets at dawn, buckets at dusk, shoulder and rope burning in the same place until the ache felt like membership. The mare carried her share, 2 jugs balanced in canvas slings, step measured, ears flicking toward the creek's soft speech. At night, sirens blurred into dream and left their residue on waking. He heard phantom crackles where only leaves rattled. He lifted his head to listen for the dog that no longer slept at the kitchen door. The cot's thin mattress recorded his weights and returned him to a narrow groove each time he turned. The sky through the missing roof was too large. Stars clattered in his chest like dropped nails. He tried work that used to answer questions. He turned soil with a shovel and found it brittle an inch down, the fire's memories stitched through like wire. He tested seed, mustard, clover, a handful of wildflower mixes in paper packets with cheerful illustrations, and the ground said, "Later." He cut new rails for the fence line with a saw, the old posts holding their char like scars in an honest face. A gate hung crooked, and he let it because a straight line would be a lie with no roof behind it. The mare learned this new geometry, where gaps had widened, where wind ran a different path through what used to be walls. He taught her the command for slow again, and she taught him the shape of careful. Paper kept arriving, notices with deadlines printed in stern fonts, a warning about hazardous debris and penalties for noncompliance, a flyer for a hearing with his name misspelled but his property drawn correctly in rectangles that did not fit the slope's hand. Each envelope made a sound like a dry leaf when it slid onto the porch that no longer existed. He picked them up from the stump where the postman had decided to stop, recognizing grace in small stubbornness. He read, folded, stacked, and weighed his stack with a stone, as if his consent might be a matter of ounces. Neighbors became voices more than faces. Engines idled on the road, brief kindnesses delivered like birds leaving seeds. A sack of feed, a coil of wire, a jar of balm for burns set on a rock with a note that did not ask how he was. The valley called without insisting. Grief here understood solitude like a religion and did not mock it. When company came, it came in work clothes, not apologies. They replaced the beam with him, used their shoulders, joked enough to remind the air how to carry laughter again, and left before evening asked questions. He taught the mare new work, because action was the only prayer that changed the day's weather. They dragged limbs to a burn pile that would not be lit. They carried salvage boards from where the house's bones had fallen. He showed her the remnant hive and set a boundary around it with rope and scents. She lowered her head, but did not intrude. Bees landed on her coat sometimes, small commas resting in a sentence they trusted to continue. She learned stillness that had nothing to do with fear. The cluster multiplied like a secret that had chosen its tellers carefully. He split off a small box when numbers exceeded memory, fingers coaxing, smoke talking, and blue grammar. He assembled frames from scrap, cleaning nails with his teeth, and slid them into a rescued super that smelled faintly of old summer. The hum filled more of the room that had no walls. He stopped flinching at every sudden sound and began bracing instead, a difference only the body notices and respects. There were setbacks that wanted to be stories. A raccoon found the feeder one night and scattered what sweetness could be taken without permission. He reset the stones and added wire. A gust lifted a tarp and sent it flapping like a wounded thing. He climbed under it in rain, the mare steadying the corner with her shoulder while he tied knots he had forgotten he knew. A man from the county left a fluorescent notice zip-tied to the oak. Unauthorized structures must be removed pending review. He touched the plastic as if testing whether it had a pulse. He did not remove anything that lived. When sleep failed, he walked the property with a flashlight's beam kept small. He listened to the ground carry news: fox, deer, the bright staccato of a quail in low shrubs, the hush of bees easing their night shift. He talked to them sometimes, the way one might speak to a room full of elders, not asking for miracles, reporting weather. The mare followed at a distance that was loyalty, not leash. They learned the edges of dark together. At the fireline, the exact place where Heat had lost appetite, he always stopped. On one side, a black map. On the other, grass that had returned without asking permission. He was learning the scripture of lines. He went to town less often. The feed store had new faces and a display of evacuation kits near the door. Owners traded tips on insurance like recipes that might never taste good but kept a family alive. He stood at the register, counted cash in jars, and left more quickly than he meant to. In the parking lot, a teenager asked if the horse was okay. He nodded. The boy said his school would plant trees. He nodded again and did not say that trees are not planted, they are adopted for years. At home, the radio spoke the hearing's countdown. 2 weeks, then 1, then days that lost their names and became numbers. He prepared like a man readying a winter that might be partial or long. He gathered photographs the fire had not taken, blurry, off-angle, generous, and put them in a bag. He wrote bullet points on a board salvaged from the barn. Pollinator corridor, flood mitigation by ground cover, shade as infrastructure, the oak as archive. He practiced saying sentences that would be allowed in a room with microphones. Less feeling, more fact. He practiced being uninterrupted. He practiced being interrupted and not breaking. He taught the Mare trick he had never cared for before, to stand without a halter and wait, no matter who called, no matter what moved at the edge of her eye. He did it not for spectacle, but because trust turned out to be a skill and not only a tenderness. He placed a cone 10 paces away, walked to it, and returned while she counted him with her ears. He increased the distance until the cone was at the elk fence. He spoke her name only once when she shifted. When she held, he exhaled, and some old panic in him took the hint and softened. On the eve of the hearing, wind drew chalk lines of dust down the road. He bathed the mare in the creek, water throwing cold needles into heat. She leaned into his hand when he cleaned the soot from her fetlocks, the same lift and hold they had practiced 100 mornings that tasted like honey. He combed her mane, thought of rope, of lifelines, of hair braided before a long journey. He oiled the old halter until it remembered blue. He set out clean clothes and a jar of honey with ash trapped like stars in amber. He filled the feeder one last time and watched the bees arrive as if on invitations written in scent. Night brought a dream that did not end in fire. He stood in the doorway that no longer stood and watched summer move across the hill without flame. The oak wore leaves that chimed in a wind without sirens. A child's laugh did not break. He awoke with the sound of the mare chewing and found that it was enough. Morning walked up the slope on cool feet. He poured coffee into a metal cup and could taste the water's old path through slate and root. He practiced his sentences again. Pollinators increase yield. Shade reduces soil temperature by measurable degrees. The oak predates your maps and will outlast your plans if we allow it. He did not practice the sentence that would break him if he said it. This is my home. He folded the papers, set the jar in a cardboard box, took the lead rope, and rested his hand where the mare's neck met her shoulder, the hinge on which they both turned. On the road, the world seemed to have decided on ordinary weather. Sparrows argued in hedges, a truck passed with dogs hanging joy from the windows. He felt the hearing as a ridge he would crest soon enough, the way a rider feels a summit under hoof before seeing the valley beyond. He did not look back at the seam and its hum. He did not need to. The sound had moved inside his chest and found a place to live where panic used to keep a chair. At the last bend, he stopped and faced the property. The morning made the char look like velvet instead of wound. The oak stood in its patience. The rope around the branch fluttered like a quiet flag. He raised the jar and let the light take it. His reflection swam in the honey for an instant, man, horse, sky stitched into one trembling picture, then steadied. He breathed out, and the mare's ears moved in agreement. They stepped forward.
The first color returned without asking permission. It threaded up through cinders in thin spears, fireweed setting little flags, lupine folding blue into the black, mustard dusting the ash with a yellow that dared the eye to look longer. He saw it because the mare stopped and lowered her head, nostrils drinking a scent that did not belong to ruin. When he knelt, his fingertips came away green, and the smear on his skin looked like a note from a season that had not forgotten his name. He was not prepared for softness. He had trained himself to expect the next heart shape. Yet the morning's light carried secrets differently now, not as a warning, but as a quiet invitation. Bees found the flowers faster than the flowers expected. He watched one worker swagger home with legs fat with pollen, a ridiculous triumph against a graph of what should have been possible. The remnant hive's pitch shifted by a degree that his hands heard before his ears did. He lifted the cracked shelter's edge and saw a tighter circle, attendants moving with the assurance of a story retold and believed. The queen traced her slow constellation, while a few new faces, fuzzy with youth, learned the geometry of work. A boy came up the road with a note that did not fit the county's fonts. He was 8 or 12, in the way rural boys are both until asked. His hair made wild by wind, his shadow riding ahead of him on a stick. He handed over the paper with the solemnity reserved for important errands. "Mama says to give you this," he said, and looked at the mare, the way one looks at a river before summer. The note was written on the back of an old seed catalog page, a cluster of handwriting that had practiced patience. Community workday, Saturday, sun up. Bring gloves, shovels, stories, let us come. H. He folded the note and did not unfold it again. He did not need to. It was already becoming a shape in the day. He considered what accepting meant. Noise, witness, the risk of telling the valley he had not left, and then being seen enough to be asked for more. He looked at the mare. She had grass on her lip like a child caught stealing icing. He laughed, and the sound felt like a joint releasing into its proper groove. He walked to the oak with a small tray of starts that he had bagged from a friend in town. Yarrow, sage, a stubborn salvia with leaves that held onto water like a lesson. He planted one at the root where the charred gave way to living wood, pressing soil around it with the tenderness reserved for throats and wrists. He did not tell himself stories about what would come of it. He moved the way bees moved, outward, then home, repeat. The mare stood in dapple, eyes half closed, tail writing a slow poem about flies. A breeze lifted, cleaner than before, and brought him a sound that made his scalp prickle. The hum had settled into a register that meant the hive knew what it was again. In the afternoon, he dragged the salvaged whiteboard from the barn shadow and wrote words that belonged to rooms with microphones, then crossed them out and wrote the words he could say with his whole body. Pollinator corridor became bees need bloom as road. Shade infrastructure became leaves make cool. Heritage tree became this oak knows us. He set the board against the oak and read the simple sentences aloud until he could hear their weight and not just their shape. The mare flicked an ear with each period as if counting cadence. The day slid toward evening with the care of someone carrying glass. He refilled the feeder at the remnant and watched as bees returned from the new flowers, the dust of color on their legs, the same stubborn palette that was reclaiming the ground. He lifted a frame from the box that he had assembled from scraps and saw the first fragile wax comb, a handkerchief of work that wanted to become a house. He felt something in his chest lift and settle, a bird testing a ledge, not elation, its quieter cousin, permission. He walked the perimeter where the proposed road would tear the land's sentence in two, and tried to imagine noise replacing wind, tires replacing hooves, a plaque where the oak currently made shade for children. He failed to imagine it well. His body refused the image like food turned in the mouth.
He turned back and the valley showed him small movements. A lizard warming on a stone. A hawk floating without urgency. The mare lifting her head at the exact moment bees shifted from work to the threshold ritual that looks like prayer. The mare did not arrive as vision. It arrived as a task. He remembered the box of bee hotels a neighbor had left months ago, a half-forgotten donation from a town project that had lost momentum. He dug it out from under a tarp and read the simple instructions. Bamboo tubes, wooden blocks drilled clean, mounted where sun touched morning but not noon. He hung 3 along the fence facing the new bloom, each with a ribbon of blue halter thread tied at the corner, a code the valley would understand without comment. He smiled at the foolishness and at the science both, and decided he could be a man who did not choose between them. At dusk, the boy returned with his mother, who introduced herself as Hora, and then looked at the mare the way priests look at icons when alone. She apologized for the note's assumption, and then did not apologize for anything else. "We will come," she said, and the simplicity of the verb was an absolution. He said Saturday's sun up. She nodded. The boy asked if the bees would sting him if he stood still. He said yes and no, and taught him to breathe like smoke. He went to the creek in the last light and filled the bucket, because ritual is easier to resume than invent. The mare drank, then lifted her head and dripped a crown of water back into the world. The sound the droplets made on stone was specific and repeated until it became a metronome. He found himself timing his breath to it. He found himself timing the day to breath. He found himself within a calendar that had nothing to do with paper. Night came without the old fear. He lay on the cot and watched stars hold their places through the rectangle where the roof had been. The wind moved leaf to leaf on the oak, a gentle rumor if rumors could heal. He slept and did not dream of fire. He dreamed instead of frames heavy with light, and of the mare standing in a doorway made of nothing but air, ears forward in the direction of morning. He woke before the ridge blued, and sat up into a feeling he did not name because naming it might fracture it. He stepped into cool that belonged to summer, and felt the day choose him back. When he lifted the cracked shelter, the hum met him first, then the sight. Clean white comb where black had been. A new ring of attendants. The queen's slow bright path through their bodies. He looked at the mare, and she looked back, and he saw in the circle of her eye what the hive had taught him. A small center can hold when the work of the many is devotion. He turned toward the oak and touched the start he had planted. It had not grown in the night. Growth does not care for theatrics, but it had not died. It held on with the quiet ferocity of roots that trust water will arrive because the earth has kept its promise before. He stood there and understood the shape of his argument, the one he would make to people who needed grafts, that resilience is simply love with chores. Saturday arrived carrying hands. The road filled before sun, with trucks breathing coffee and resolve. Boots tapped ash from their treads, shovels leaned like notes against the stave. He walked down to meet them with the mare at his shoulder, halter draped loose, and felt the old weight of hosting settle as something simpler, welcoming. Hara split the volunteers into pairs and threes with the easy authority of a person who has once rebuilt a kitchen from a single unburnt pan. He pointed to the map in his head, made visible on the salvaged whiteboard. Bees need bloom as road. Leaves may cool. This oak knows us. And watched the words travel into other people's bodies. They began by giving water a path. Shovels bit the earth along a swale that curved like a sentence, coming to its gentlest claws. He showed where to aim the slope so the first real rain would linger instead of tear. The mare hauled a small sledge of stones, hooves precise, ears ticking to every voice, and at each pause, someone's hand found the velvet of her muzzle as if gratitude needed a place to land. He seeded the swale with the blend he had chosen for stubbornness. Yarrow, Phacelia, Crimson Clover, broadcasting with the same wrist that had once flung grain to chickens at dusk. Children followed, pressing seed with the soles of their shoes and the ritual attention of officiants. Bee hotels went up along the fence. Bamboo tubes, clean and cool, tucked into frames. Cedar blocks drilled to hold, tied at the corners with blue thread. He showed a boy how to angle them to morning light and shade them from noon, how to place them near bloom, but not in the path of a horse that knew her work and would not see them as fragile. The boy asked whether bees would move in today. He said not today, and the boy nodded as if he had expected that patience would be the price of belonging. At the cracked log he taught smoke as language. 2 coughs, small, not a sermon. A translation from disruption into calm. Hara's hands learned quickly, moving on the breath speed, not the wrists. They lifted the shelter and slid a rescued frame inside the seam. A new sheet of calm hung like unfurled silk, delicate and intentioned. He spoke to the cluster as to a room of elders, reporting weather, declaring neighbors, promising quiet, and the hum answered by thickening into a tone the body believes before the ear does. By noon, wind curled heat into the work. Shade sails bloomed from salvaged tarp and saplings. Someone brought cold melon, and he tasted summer's forgiveness on his tongue. They rested in patches of dapple, voices soft, the mare asleep standing, one hind hoof cocked, tail stirring flies with sleepy grace. He watched the way strangers arranged themselves around labor to become less strange. He recognized the relief that comes when effort acquires audience. Not applause, just a witness that tells muscles their use means something wider. Afternoon turned to carpentry. Cinder blocks became pedestals for new hive stands. Salvaged 2x4s learned a second life. He measured by eye and then by touch, trusting his hands to correct his memory's pride. He explained why hives must lift from ground, cooling air under bellies, a protection from damp, and a signal to small predators that dinner had moved upstairs. And people nodded, making the wisdom theirs. He painted the wood with leftover white, not for pretty, but for heat. The sun has its own appetite, and paint is a fence in a season without fences. A setback arrived the way setbacks do, without a soundtrack. A sudden gust pulled at a shade sail and snapped a knot that seemed perfect an hour before. The tarp bucked. Dust leaped. The mare flinched, and then, remembering the new lesson of stillness, squared and leaned her shoulder against the central post as if born to hold up tents. He climbed the ladder with Hara bracing and retied the corner with a farmer's knot learned from a man whose hands smelled of rope and rain. The sails settled with a sigh, and the group exhaled as one. Laughter showed up late, and stayed. He assigned a small crew to the foraging corridor, a path of blooming promise stitched from his fence line to Ruth's fallow field, with permission granted by a voicemail last night that had sounded like grief learning the word yes. They planted in chores, rather than beauty, milkweed for monarchs, time to run underfoot and invite bees lower to the lips of small children, salvia to keep color when others went tired, buckwheat for speed and generosity. He did not impose order. He let appetite compose its own rows. The corridor would be a road no map would recognize, and every pollinator would. As the sun changed key, he walked a perimeter with 2 men who had once surveyed lines for the county and now wore volunteer shirts washed to paler. He asked them to teach him the language that wins hearings: buffer, mitigation, precedent. In return, he taught them the language that wins seasons: bloom succession, nectar flows, the way shade made from leaves lowers soil temperature by degrees the hand can feel, and how that small mercy anchors a day. They practiced sentences together that would walk into microphones without tripping. They trimmed the talk of its poetry and found that what remained still sang. He kept one hand on the mare's neck more often than he knew, a touch that passed news both ways. When a chainsaw started on the far slope and died, her ears flicked until he spoke her name once and she returned to the ground's calmer conversation. He taught a teenager how to ask a horse to yield her hip without fear, just posture and breath. He watched the kid grow taller by an inch, made of courage and understanding. He learned the teenager's name and used it like a tool and a gift. Evening brought the developers in clean shirts, surprise on their faces as if they had arrived at a party they had not planned. Clipboards appeared. Words like liability and compliance were placed on the table as if they were bread. Hara met them with forms she had printed from county websites, proof that the work being done was legal as rain.
He stepped in only when the map came out again, and the pale ribbon cut through his orchard like an old wound reopened. He put the jar of ash-flecked honey on the hood and asked them to taste. One did. He watched the man evaluate like a judge. The man swallowed and said it was good, in a voice that admitted more than it meant to. He said nothing back and let the silence carry its portion of persuasion. They left with murmurings about hearings and protocols. The volunteers returned to tasks without being asked. He felt anger stir and then flow into motion the way the creek deepens itself by accepting stones. He did not feed the anger to people who had come to feed work. Night broke early across the slope. Headlamps made constellations at ground level. Hammers became fireflies. He heard the remnant hive shift to its bedtime murmur and felt, unexpectedly, a peace wider than the day had promised. He dismissed the crew with thanks that did not try to be enough, and watched taillights stitch red lines down the road. He stayed with Hara and 2 others to tidy tools into an order that would welcome morning rather than accuse it. When the last truck turned the bend, quiet took its rightful place. Crickets rehearsed late summer. The mare blew softly and shook her neck, the sound like cloth being folded. He walked to the oak and checked the start he had planted. The leaves held tiny cups of water that had collected from sweat and breath and something like grace. He touched the trunk, palm to living, as if plugging into a current he did not need to understand, to be used by. Days made a rhythm that looked like endurance and felt like relief. Mornings began with water lines tested, shade sails tightened, feeders checked, and the mare walking the fence to learn what had changed in the night. He set a schedule for bloom, which plots to irrigate from the creek on odd days, which to leave to the memory of dew. He kept a notebook in his pocket and wrote, not to make a book, but to make a spine. Swarm management plans took shape. A friend promised a nucleus colony if his remnant refused to expand. He accepted the promise like a rung on a ladder he hoped not to need, but was glad to have. Setbacks came as if the valley believed growth should be earned. A skunk found the base of a stand and dug with tenacity born of hunger. He laid hardware cloth and said aloud that hunger would be respected, but not given the keys. A gust knuckled a shade sail and tore a seam. Horace stitched it with dental floss and a joke that made the day easier to carry. Heat sent bees bearding along the high face like a living beard. He opened the top vent with a pocket knife, and the hive thanked him by returning to work. A letter arrived from the county that smelled of toner and delay. The hearing had moved up by 3 days. He read the notice, folded it once, and slid it into the notebook. Panic came to the door and found the hinges strengthened by chores. He set a meeting under the oak, and the valley arrived with lawn chairs and casseroles, advice and quiet. The mare stood near the circle, as if understanding that circles break when unwitnessed, and hold when watched by eyes that have outlasted storms. They rehearsed testimony with interruptions to mimic the way power tries to make order out of discomfort. People stumbled and found their feet. The youngest spoke first and last. On the morning before the hearing, he walked to the remnant without dread. The seam had grown into a box, the box into a hum that made his teeth buzz with the pleasure of work. He lifted a frame and saw capped brood, the little domes like a map of cities not yet learning how to be cities. He replaced it with care and stood back to watch, because watching had become part of work, not a luxury he accused himself of. The mare came to stand shoulder to shoulder, the way she did when asking him to move into the next thing without fear. He put on his clean shirt, but kept the boots that knew the property's true grammar. He loaded the jar, the notebook, the whiteboard with words simpler than grief. He tied his hair back the way one ties rope they intend to trust. He said the mare's name and she stepped into place at his side. He did not lead. He walked with. At the county building, fluorescent light did the cruel thing it always does to people who earn their living under sun. He recognized the developer's shirts and the committee's practiced expressions. He recognized also his neighbor's shoulders pulled back by a purpose that had chosen them. When his turn came, he placed the jar where microphones could see it and put his hand on the whiteboard, not as a prop, but as a spine. He spoke of bloom as road and leaves as roof, of bees as archivists and horses as witnesses, of a valley that has learned to measure time in chores rather than headlines. He used the words buffer and mitigation and precedent only where they could do no harm to the truth. There were questions about budgets and safety. He answered with numbers and hands. There were interruptions. He paused, let silence become his ally, and continued on the breath's beat. The mare stood outside under a tree that wore smaller history than the oak, and waited with the patience of those who know that bodies tell truths halls forget. When he finished, he did not feel triumph. He felt completion, which is quieter and more binding. They drove home in ordinary weather. The road passed through places that would remain fields, and places that would always threaten to become diagrams. The valley rose to meet them, its hum louder now that he had returned from rooms where hums are not believed. Back at the property, he loosened the mare's halter, and she remained beside him because waiting had become habit and love both. He walked to the hive, lifted the lid a fraction, and released the breath he had held since maps were laid on his table-gate. The bees went on with their work, untroubled by hearings or the theater of men. He laid his palm on the oak and felt the pulse that trees keep, a ledger older than ink. He said aloud to the mare, to the bees, to the ground that had agreed to hold him, "We keep going."
The decision arrived like weather, announced, argued over, then simply there. In the county hall, after motions and seconds and a silence with weight, the chair cleared her throat and read the words that would redraw the valley without erasing it. Conservation easement granted, access road rerouted along the ridge's far contour, heritage protection for the oak and pollinator corridor recognized as public good. Applause tried to be loud and failed with grace. Relief prefers the register of breath. He did not raise his fists. He put a palm on the jar and felt the sun-warmed glass as if touching a shoulder that had carried him. Outside, the mare stood in the borrowed shade of a sycamore, head high, scanning faces as if choosing which ones to remember as herd. Children touched her neck and pulled their hands back as though they had been blessed. He loosened the lead and let it hang, the small ceremony of trust performed without audience or theory. Hara hugged him with the firmness of someone checking a beam for give. "You did it," she said. He shook his head. "We did it," he answered, and the pronoun fit like a clean shirt after hard work. They drove home on a road that would remain a road and not a plan. Clouds stacked like spare hay bales over the ridge. He stopped at the bend where valley first becomes valley and looked down. The shade sails made pale squares of mercy. The swell curved as intended, a soft geometry that would turn first rain into memory instead of damage. The oak, black sleeve and green crowned, kept its place like a quiet judge who knows which laws matter. Back on the land, he set the jar by the kitchen's ghost, not as trophy but as witness. He walked to the remnant hive that was no longer a remnant and lifted the lid thinly, enough to hear the register of work without asking for proof. The hum met him in the chest. He pulled a single frame and found the queen, moving with the calm of one who understands debts and how to pay them with continuity. He brushed a finger along the wood and replaced it as carefully as a name put back in a mouth after long absence. Evening drew them to the fireline that had become a threshold instead of a scar. He and the mare walked side by side to the seam where char gave way to grass, and stood there as if greeting an old border guard who had finally learned mercy. He held the halter in his hand and did not lift it. The mare did not step away. Trust had been paid in chores. It yielded interest worth keeping in sight. Neighbors arrived not for work, but for the kind of gathering that repairs what work cannot reach. They carried bread, tomatoes still warm from sun, a pie with a lattice a hand had learned long ago from another hand now gone. Someone brought a guitar that knew only 3 chords and all the songs that mattered. Stories walked without embarrassment. Of waterlines dug and knees bruised, of bees bearding and then choosing to stay, of a boy who had learned how to stand so still that a worker landed on his wrist and mistook him for a branch.
Laughter rose and fell like the creek in spring. He spoke when asked, only then. He said not that they had won, but that they had been permitted to continue the work that had already defined them. He said the road would bend because they had bent together, not because maps had learned empathy. He said the valley would be tested again by wind, by heat, by the slow violence of forgetting, and that sweetness would hold only if chores were kept. He lifted the jar and let dusk reach through it, turning the air gold. For a moment faces wore the light of something older than victory. When the gathering thinned and the quiet returned to the register of crickets, he walked to the oak and pressed his palm to bark that had survived hotter arguments. He felt the slow ledger of sap and time, a balance sheet uninterested in applause. Debt repaid, he said softly, not to the county or the developers, or even the idea of resilience, but to the land that had held him while he learned the humility of staying. Behind him the mare stepped closer until her shoulder touched his back. He leaned barely, and the contact wrote an answer no paper could capture. In the last light he slipped the halter from her neck and dropped it over the fence post, blew again where oil had coaxed memory from lever. She followed him without rope toward the old field, through rows he would replant, past bee hotels ribboned in the halter's thread. At the hive he opened the lid no more than an inch and listened to the dark, which was no longer emptiness, but a room full of bodies that understood each other by work. He closed it and stood very still. He had nothing to name and plenty to keep.
Summer learned the valley's name again and spoke it in a warmer key. The light that once hesitated now poured without apology, slipping through new leaves, laying long hands across the rebuilt railings of a porch that chose utility over memory's flourishes. Frames came heavy, wax sealed with a quiet pride. When he lifted them, the air bloomed into a scent that was not only flowers, but weather, labor, and time. The mare dozed in the oak's dapple, with one ear tilted toward him, the other tuned to the small grammar of flies and wind. Her breathing the metronome the land had adopted. Children traced bees with their fingers in the air, practicing not to touch and learning that reverence is a kind of touch. They followed him along the foraging corridor, naming what they could, yarrow, thyme, buckwheat, and inventing tender names for what they could not. He taught them the trick of stepping softly, the courtesy of shadows, the way a hand held out with stillness can carry courage from one body to another. They taught him how quickly silence can become awe when it is shared. The porch sat smaller and truer than the house that had stood before. Its boards held chairs that were meant to be used, not curated. Jars of honey stood cooling like small suns. Ash flecks caught within some of them, the way an old story holds smoke in its vowels. He ate bread torn by clean hands, and drizzled sweetness over it until the air itself felt mended. When neighbors came, they did not ask for the past to speak more loudly than the present. They brought tools to fix a hinge, seedlings someone had started on a windowsill, a guitar that knew just enough to let a valley sing without embarrassment. The mare wore a new halter the color of fresh water, and the memory of blue lived in its weave. She had learned to stand wherever he set his hand, to wait while he stepped away, to come when asked or when something in him tilted and she felt the weight shift. Sometimes in evening, he slipped the halter off and walked the boundary without rope or word, her shadow overlapping his like a print that could not be mistaken. Trust had grown into habit. Habit had softened into peace. Not every day bent like a ribbon. Heat stacked itself on certain afternoons until even the bees bearded in doorways, choosing air over interiors. Wind tried on the voice it had used before and then let it go. He kept the chores that had kept him, checking vents, shading hives, turning water into mercy where roots could drink it slowly. When a skunk tested the hardware cloth again, he patched without anger and set a dish of water where the creature could drink without breaking anything that sang. He had outgrown the theatrics of victory. He preferred arrangements. He stood often at the fireline that had learned how to be a threshold rather than a wound. Grass stood shoulder to shoulder with char, unashamed of the difference in their ages. He placed his boot on one side and then the other, remembering the day he had tied a strip of veil on the branch above the seam. The ribbon had faded to a soft whisper of color, and still announced itself when wind came softly. He left it. Some flags are meant for those who already know what they mean. Autumn sent its early scouts, cool mornings, acorns like small thoughts, a longer shadow from the oak that made noon feel honest. He extracted the season's last honey and set aside jars for those who had lifted, carried, and chosen with him. He labeled one simply Hara and left it on her porch without knocking, then walked away with the relief peculiar to uncomplicated gratitude. He set aside another for Ruth, a sweetness marked for a woman who had found a different yes and needed to taste that the valley kept loving in her absence. On the first storm of the new year, when wind smudged the ridge but sirens stayed quiet, he stood in the doorway the porch now framed and watched rain draw vertical music on the yard. The mare turned her head to present one cheek to the weather, accepting it as correction rather than threat. Bee stayed home and hummed the room into comfort. He breathed to that hum the way a man breathes to a familiar prayer, not asking for anything, simply aligning. He built a small shelf near the oak and placed on it the jar with ash stars, a handful of nails bent and straightened, the old halter cleaned and coiled like a sentence finished without regret. He did not visit it as a shrine. He passed it as one passes a well, grateful, aware, unneedy. New work kept arriving on time, mending fence, lifting frames, teaching hands younger than his to move in ways that do not frighten living things. He wore his boots out at the heel and resoled them. He did the same for hope. There were evenings when he and the mare walked to the highest point and sat with the valley on their laps. From there the swale curved like a learned lesson. The shade sails breathed like tents at a fair that never leaves, and the hive roofs made a quiet skyline patient with weather. He spoke toward the oak without words, the way one speaks toward a fire whose language is all listening. The mare lowered her head and pressed her muzzle to his shoulder, a touch that contained the whole geometry of what had held. When wind rose again, as it always will somewhere, he did not rehearse loss. He checked anchors, folded tarps, tightened knots, and set the kettle up where water could be turned into solace. The bees thickened their winter cluster with a murmur that sounded like consent. The mare took a step closer than was necessary and made necessary seem like a choice. He understood, finally and quietly, what he had been building, not safety against weather, but a practice of staying. On the last warm night before the season tilted, he opened the jar and dipped his thumb, tasted a sweetness that carried every hour he had carried, and closed his eyes. The flavor held a note of smoke so thin that it was more memory than taste, an honesty that made the honey truer. He turned to the mare and let her lick the salt from his hand. The stars took their places as if a roof had never been needed for looking up. Morning would come like work. Evening would come like rest. Between them, a valley would keep singing in a voice made of labor, forgiveness, and light.